The Texas Senate war nobody saw coming. There's a political battle happening right now in Texas that most people aren't paying attention to, and that's exactly why you should be. Because this isn't the usual red versus blue fight. This isn't Republicans versus Democrats. This is something far more unusual, far more explosive, and frankly, far more telling about the state of American politics in 2026. This is Democrats at war with each other. And not just any Democrats. We're talking about progressives attacking progressives, the left going after the left. And at the center of it all, a black congresswoman from Texas who says she never expected the most racially charged attacks of her political career to come from her own side. Let that sink in for a moment. Jasmine Crockett, one of the most recognizable progressive voices in the entire country, someone who built her entire career fighting for civil rights, someone who became a household name by speaking truth to power on national television, is now standing in the middle of a Democratic primary and saying, "The people coming after me with race-based attacks aren't Republicans. They're from my own party." So what is actually going on in Texas? Who are the players? What are the stakes? And why should you, no matter where you live, care deeply about what happens in this primary on March 3rd? Let's go all the way in. First, you need to understand the geography of this fight. Not just physical geography, but political geography. Texas has been a Republican stronghold for decades. The last Democrat to win a statewide office in Texas was in 1994. Think about that. Over 30 years without a single Democratic win at the statewide level. Governors, senators, attorneys general, all Republican, year after year, cycle after cycle. So when Democrats run for Senate in Texas, they are almost always running against the odds. They are running into a headwind. They know it going in. And historically, the Democratic Party has poured resources into Texas Senate races hoping, always hoping, that this will finally be the year the math changes, that the demographics shift enough, that the suburban voters break enough, that Texas turns, or at minimum, becomes competitive. It hasn't happened yet. In 2024, Collin Allred, a former NFL player, a moderate Democrat, a man with a compelling personal story and serious name recognition, ran against Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz, one of the most controversial and polarizing Republican senators in the country, a man who fled to Cancun during a winter storm that killed dozens of his own constituents, a man whose own colleagues in the Senate have publicly said unflattering things about him, and Collin Allred still lost, by nearly 10 points. So the question heading into 2026 is, what does the Democratic Party in Texas do now? Do they try the moderate approach again? Do they go further left and try to energize the base? Do they recruit a new kind of candidate entirely? And that question is precisely what has torn this primary apart. Enter James Talarico, Texas State Representative. Young, energetic, articulate, and unabashedly progressive. He announced his Senate candidacy and quickly began building momentum. Before Crockett entered the race, Talarico was facing off against Collin Allred, who was gearing up for another run after his 2024 loss. Now here's where the first explosion happened, the one that set the tone for everything that followed. According to Allred, during their interactions, Talarico referred to him as a mediocre black man, in reference to his campaign performance. Not his character, not his personal life, his campaign. But the phrase used, mediocre black man, was the kind of thing that doesn't just disappear into the political ether. It lands. It sits. It stings. Talarico denied it, categorically. He said he would never attack anyone based on race. He acknowledged that his criticism of Allred's campaign strategy could be interpreted in a painful way, given America's history with racism, and he said he was deeply sensitive to that. He even went out of his way to say he respects Allred. But acknowledgement isn't the same as erasure. The allegation was out there. The damage, whatever the truth may be, was already seeping into the ground of this race like water into concrete, invisible but structural. Then Allred dropped out. December 2025. He looked at the landscape, looked at the competition, and decided this wasn't his moment, which opened the door. And through that door walked Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine Crockett is not a politician who blends into the background. She is not someone who hedges every sentence and speaks in the careful, sanitized language of consultants and focus groups. She is sharp. She is direct. She has a lawyer's mind and a preacher's timing. She can dismantle an argument in a committee hearing and make it look effortless. She went viral multiple times in 2024 during congressional hearings. She became a face of Democratic resistance and progressive energy at the national level. When she announced she was running for Senate in Texas, the progressive world took notice. Here was someone with a national profile, a grassroots following, a powerful story, and the kind of fundraising ability that most candidates in contested primaries can only dream about. But almost immediately, something strange started happening. Instead of the progressive lane opening up for her, instead of Democrats who care about civil rights and representation rallying around a black female civil rights attorney running for Senate in one of the largest states in the country, she started taking fire. And not from the right, from the left. Now let's stop here, because this is the part that people need to really sit with. In American politics, we've become so conditioned to the left versus right frame that we often forget how vicious and consequential inter-party battles can be. We forget that some of the most personal, most cutting, most devastating political attacks in history have come not from across the aisle, but from within the same tent. Think about it from Crockett's perspective. She has spent her career as a civil rights attorney. She knows the tactics. She knows the history. She has studied, argued, and litigated cases involving racial discrimination. She can look at a photograph, an advertisement, a campaign mailer, and immediately recognize certain choices in lighting, in color grading, in the darkening of skin tone, that have a long and documented history of being used to make black candidates look more threatening, more unfamiliar, more other, to suburban and moderate voters. And she says she saw it happening to her, in ads, from people who are supposed to be on the same side. When she spoke to supporters, she said it plainly. She said she was used to attacks from Republicans. She'd built her political skin against those. But attacks from the left, from within her own ideological world, that was different. That was unexpected. That hit differently. She said, and I want you to hear this carefully, as a civil rights attorney, I can tell when they run ads and they're darkening my skin, and I say to myself, I know what that is. She knows what that is. That's not a vague accusation. That's a woman with legal expertise in civil rights looking at political advertising and recognizing a deliberate technique designed to trigger racial bias in viewers. Subconscious or conscious, it doesn't matter. The history of darkening the skin of black political candidates in attack ads is real, documented, and deeply ugly. It's been done in races across the country for decades. It was done to Harold Ford Jr. in Tennessee in 2006. It was done in local races and state races and congressional races. It's a known tactic, and Crockett is saying she saw it being used against her, by Democrats, in a Democratic primary. She didn't name the specific ads. She didn't name who authorized them or who produced them. That ambiguity is significant. It leaves room for interpretation, for debate, for pushback. And the campaigns involved haven't publicly responded to questions about it. But here's the thing. The accusation existing at all tells you something profound about the state of this race. This is a Democratic Senate primary in Texas, where one candidate, a black woman, is alleging race-based political manipulation from within her own party's ecosystem. That is extraordinary. And the reason it matters beyond Texas, the reason you need to care about this, even if you live in Maine or Montana or Michigan, is because it speaks to something much larger happening inside the Democratic Party right now. There is a civil war underway, not a metaphorical one, a real, structural, ideological battle for the soul and the strategy of the Democratic Party, after years of electoral losses, internal contradictions, and a failure to build a coherent national message. The fight in Texas is just one visible, dramatic, personality-driven expression of that larger conflict. Who does the Democratic Party want to be? Who does it want to run? What kind of candidate does it believe can win in 2026 and beyond? And critically, how does it handle the intersection of race and electability? Because that intersection is where the tension lives, and it is volatile. Let's bring in the late show dimension because this added fuel to an already burning fire. James Talarico appeared on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. National television, huge platform, the kind of exposure that money can't fully buy. Organic, credible, cool factor exposure. The appearance gave Talarico a moment, a spotlight, a chance to introduce himself to Democratic voters and media consumers far beyond Texas. Crockett says she was never invited, not once. Since launching her Senate campaign, she claims she received 0 invitations from the show. Now maybe that's a booking decision based on scheduling or availability or 100 other logistical factors. Maybe it's completely innocent. But in the context of a race already charged with accusations of racial favoritism and unequal treatment, the optics were impossible to ignore. Talarico gets the national TV moment, Crockett doesn't. Talarico is white, Crockett is black. You don't have to believe there was malicious intent for that pattern to be uncomfortable. You just have to be paying attention. CBS and Colbert's team didn't publicly respond to Crockett's claim. The silence itself became part of the story. And then there's the money question, because there always is. Crockett has openly raised the possibility that some of the liberal criticism she's receiving is paid for. She has insinuated, without full specificity, that certain attacks coming from the left aren't organic grassroots opposition, but rather funded, coordinated efforts designed to damage her campaign. This is not a fringe paranoia in the world of modern political primaries. Super PACs and dark money groups have been involved in Democratic primaries for years, sometimes backing establishment-aligned candidates against progressive challengers, sometimes doing the opposite, sometimes just creating chaos that benefits whoever is most insulated from the noise. The money in this race is real and significant. Texas Senate seats carry enormous symbolic weight. Winning one for Democrats would be historic. That means donors with money and agendas are paying attention. That means outside groups are calculating. That means the forces shaping this primary are not limited to what's visible on the surface. Crockett is smart enough to know that. She has signaled it to her supporters. She is essentially saying, don't assume everything you're seeing is organic. Some of what looks like progressive opposition might be engineered. Whether that's true, whether anyone is actually funding attacks against her from within the left ecosystem, is something that requires follow-the-money journalism that takes time to do properly. But the allegation shapes how her supporters interpret every attack they see. It puts every critical ad, every negative tweet, every unflattering article into a different frame. Now let's talk about what's at stake in November, because the Democratic primary winner will face a Republican opponent in one of the most intense three-way primary fights the Texas GOP has seen in years. On the Republican side, you have John Cornyn, incumbent senator, Senate Minority Leader, the kind of establishment figure who has survived decades in Texas politics by being reliable and unthreatening. You have Ken Paxton, the state's Attorney General, a man who survived impeachment by his own party's legislature and came out the other side, defiant, MAGA-aligned, a culture warrior beloved by the most energized part of the Republican base. And you have Wesley Hunt, a congressman, a veteran, a younger face who represents a different kind of Republican energy. That primary is its own war. Cornyn has reportedly been warned internally that Paxton would be devastating to the party in a general election, described in some circles as a kiss of death for Republican chances if he were to win the primary. The establishment wants Cornyn. The base wants Paxton. Hunt is trying to thread a needle. The point is, whoever emerges from the Democratic primary will face a Republican opponent whose identity is not yet known, and the nature of that Republican opponent will significantly shape the general election strategy. A moderate Texas Democrat might have a better shot in a general election if Paxton wins the GOP primary. A progressive Texas Democrat might be better positioned to energize turnout against a Paxton-style candidacy. Or maybe the opposite is true. Maybe a moderate can pick off enough suburban Republicans disgusted by Paxton's baggage. These are the calculations that campaign strategists are running right now. And those calculations are part of why the Democratic primary is so ugly. Because both Crockett and Talarico believe they are the right candidate for that general election moment. Both believe their theory of the race, and both are willing to fight hard to prove it. There's something worth naming directly here, something that often goes unspoken in political coverage because it makes people uncomfortable. The question of electability and race in American politics is one of the most fraught, most dishonest, and most consequential conversations the Democratic Party keeps having without ever fully having it. For decades, there has been a strain of thinking, sometimes explicit, more often implicit, that black candidates are less electable in predominantly white states or districts, that the safest bet for Democrats trying to win difficult terrain is a white, moderate, relatable candidate who can appeal to the broadest possible middle. This thinking has been challenged and complicated by Barack Obama's 2 presidential victories, by the rise of diverse Democratic leadership across the country, by changing demographics. But it hasn't disappeared. It lives in donor rooms. It lives in consultant conversations. It lives in the quiet calculations of party operatives who never say it out loud, but who make decisions based on it. Jasmine Crockett, running for Senate in Texas, forces that conversation into the open, whether anyone likes it or not. Because she is a black woman with a progressive record, running in a state that hasn't elected a Democrat statewide in 30 years. And some people on her own side, whether they admit it or not, are making judgments about her candidacy through that lens. When she says she sees what those ads are doing to her skin tone, she is naming that unspoken calculation out loud. She is saying, I see you. I know what this is, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't happening. That takes courage. It also carries risk. Because in a primary, allegations of racial bias can be double-edged. They can galvanize your base, or they can be dismissed as deflection, as playing the race card, as a distraction from substantive debate about policy and electability. Let's zoom out one final time and ask the biggest question. What does this race tell us about where American politics is going? It tells us that the Democratic Party's internal contradictions are becoming impossible to paper over. The progressive wing and the moderate wing are not just in philosophical disagreement. They are in genuine, bitter, resource-intensive conflict. And that conflict is playing out in primaries across the country, with Texas as one of the most visible and dramatic examples. It tells us that race is not a settled question inside the Democratic coalition. The party that presents itself as the home of diversity and civil rights is wrestling, sometimes openly and sometimes not, with the same biases and power dynamics it claims to oppose. It tells us that money, media access, and institutional support still shape these races in ways that smaller donors and grassroots energy can only partially counterbalance. And it tells us that the voters of Texas, Democratic primary voters who will head to the polls starting now through March 3rd, are being asked to make a genuinely difficult choice about identity, strategy, and vision. Not just who do they like more, but what kind of party do they want to be? What theory of winning do they believe in? And who do they trust to carry their flag into what will almost certainly be an uphill general election fight? Crockett says she knows what those ads are. She says she sees the tactics being used against her by people who should know better, people who should be better. Whether voters believe her, whether they reward her for naming it or penalize her for it, whether this primary ends up being a referendum on race and power inside the Democratic Party, all of that is still being decided. The votes are being cast right now, and the story is far from over. If you made it this far, you already know this race matters. Share this with someone who needs to understand what's actually happening beneath the headlines. And stay with us, because when March 3rd comes, we're going to be right here breaking down what those results actually mean for Texas, for the Democratic Party, and for the country.